You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with Whitehall editor at the Financial Times, Sebastian Payne, and the deputy political editor at the Daily Telegraph, Lucy Fisher. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The Eyes headline looks at New Year's Eve celebrations going ahead. As Sajid Javid said, there will be no restrictions before 2022. The Daily Telegraph focuses on a New Year's Eve without restrictions, as the public is still urged to remain cautious despite the latest data showing that Omicron may be a milder variant. And the Times also leads with the government ruling out fresh restrictions ahead of the new year. The Guardian reads England goes it alone as it becomes the only UK nation not to impose stricter COVID measures post-Christmas. Where's the PM is the headline in the Mirror in reference to a record number of COVID cases in England recorded on Christmas Day. The Daily Express headline draws attention to the warning of an energy boss who says energy bills could double. The Daily Star reads Happy New Beer as temperatures are set to rise for New Year's Day. And tonight I'm joined by Sebastian Payne and Lucy Fisher. Welcome to you both. Let's start off by having a look at the Telegraph and that story in many of the other papers, the fact that there will be no new restrictions over the New Year's period and certainly not until 2022. Sebastian.
Yes, Boris Johnson examined the latest coronavirus data today in a meeting with Chris Whitty, England's chief medical officer, and other scientific and medical advisors, and came to the conclusion there was nothing new that meant they would need to bring in further restrictions. And that means essentially New Year's plans will go ahead as they would have otherwise in England, which is a stark contrast to the other three nations of the United Kingdom, where rules have come in over the past couple of days on big gatherings, on nightclubs, and on distancing indoors. And we've heard from Sajid Javid, the health secretary today, who's essentially said people be cautious, take a lateral flow test, celebrate outside you can, although where I am, it's pretty chilly, and I don't think anyone would like to do that. But fundamentally, Boris Johnson is keeping the same course he decided last week, that really ever since the Omicron wave has taken off and hospitalizations have risen in London, Boris Johnson has tried to play this delicate balance of, do you make restrictions quicker and faster to avert a crisis later, or do you sort of hang tight and hope it'll come out all right? And in the other three nations of the UK, those leaders have decided to act quicker and bring in those restrictions as cases continue to soar, hospitalizations are rising, but Boris Johnson has gone a different way, and I'm sure celebratory people across the whole of England will be delighted at this, but it remains to be seen if we come to January in 2 or 3 weeks, if hospitals are under pressure across the country, will the Prime Minister have made that right decision? Well, his ministers will think so, his MPs will, but I'm not sure if the NHS might think the Prime Minister should have maybe put some extra restrictions in at this point.
Yes, Lucy, going it alone, he seemingly is taking a huge gamble, or he's very certain that the stats, the data, is really what's leading him in this direction?
Well, I think we have to put this in context that there's only been confirmation so far that New Year's Eve can go ahead without restrictions. I think there is very much a warning and almost a hint perhaps from Sajid Javid today that in January more moves could possibly be expected. I think the news today is good for revellers, it's good for Tory MPs who are sceptical of further lockdown measures, and of course it's good for hospitality bosses, a sector that's been among the hardest hit during the pandemic. But as Sebastian said, there are worries among medics and among scientists, certainly warnings coming from the NHS about the thousands of members of staff who are off sick, leading to additional strain on the health service at this time of year. But so far, what Boris Johnson has reviewed today is the pre-Christmas data. That shows that hospitalisations are around a half of what they were last year, while the number of reported COVID cases are almost 3 times. So that just shows how far we've come with the vaccine programme. Also the news today that 12,000 so-called jingle jabs vaccinations took place on Christmas Day itself. So the booster programme rollout continues. Will it be enough to keep us without restrictions in January? it is unclear. And as we've sort of said, look to the rest of the United Kingdom, where there are curbs on indoor mixing, some further measures in Scotland, such as limits on the number of sports fans allowed into stadiums. Across Europe, many more restrictions. It could be that we yet see some further measures coming in the new year.
Yes, but up until that point, the Health Secretary, as the Eye is covering the story of no further restrictions before 2022, the Health Secretary is saying that that is the case. But in the same breath, also saying they're looking at the daily data. So how can he be so certain that there will be no restrictions before 2022? Sebastian.
Well, I think at the moment, nobody's certain of anything. And of course, that's the thing everybody just wants from their lives, to know what can they do tomorrow, next week, next month. And due to COVID generally, but also particularly the rapid spread of Omicron, that is not something politicians can particularly say here. Now, when that crucial decision was made last week, when the cabinet met and Boris Johnson went into that meeting, actually minded towards bringing in restrictions, but then they had a 2.5 hour, I think it was, cabinet meeting where the vast majority of ministers made the case against. Only 3 members of the cabinet said that they would favour restrictions at that point. The basis that Downing Street is operating on is the data has to look worse for restrictions to come in. So if things continue as they are, then they are hoping they can battle through this. The NHS will cope, hospitals won't be overwhelmed, and despite those eye-watering infection numbers that are still continuing to rise, hospitalizations, as Lucy was just saying, are nowhere near where they were last year. The vaccines plus the natural immunity we've developed over the past 12 months mean we're in a totally different position. But I think the fact is there is still this question of, can hospitals cope? Can the NHS cope? Because that's what restrictions are about now, because we know the way to stop serious illness from coronavirus is jabs. And that's what's still going very well in this country at the moment. I love the idea of 12,000 people getting up on Christmas morning, sort of opening a stocking, go running down to their GP's clinic to get a jab. But that just shows how enthusiastic people are for these sort of things. But fundamentally, I don't think anyone in Westminster really knows. They're taking it on a day-by-day, week-by-week basis. We'll hear more from the government next Monday. If the situation looks worse, and it could be entirely different, and England could follow the rest of the UK. But if it's the same as it is now, then I think it will just continue.
Yeah, we read in The Guardian, Lucy, that scientists have been critical of the decision by England not to bring in further restrictions, saying it was the moment of the greatest divergence between scientific advice and legislation seen since the start of the pandemic. That is slightly worrying, isn't it?
Well, it's a worry for Boris Johnson, certainly, if the data does get worse in coming days. And in hindsight, he's seen to have made a misstep here. I think he is stuck in a hard place, in that final week of Parliament before it rose for the Christmas recess, suffering the worst backbench rebellion of his career as 101 Tory MPs rebelled against the COVID passports measure, and really brought home to him just how fed up they are with COVID restrictions. On the other hand, scientists who've often been urging the government to go further and be overcautious in the eyes of some MPs, it's difficult for the Prime Minister to balance that. I do think at the moment, on the basis of the data that's publicly available, it does seem to be that it could be overcautious for the Prime Minister to be going any further immediately and curbing New Year's Eve restrictions, given that it seems the NHS is not under immediate threat of collapse, which has always been the great worry here. But yes, I think he will be concerned, he will be nervous. He's been accused of acting too slowly many times in the past, too slow to shut the borders previously, too slow to lock down the country. I think he will be monitoring it day by day, and things could change quickly after December the 31st if the data dramatically worsens.
The responsibility and the onus seemingly is being put back on the public, with the Health Secretary saying that people should take steps themselves to protect others. The government won't be taking any further measures. It's back in the court of the public.
That's very much the way the government has painted this ever since we had Freedom Day back in July, was to say to people, look, the government, us, we are not going to dictate life to you. You're going to have to live with this thing. Now, obviously, they've pulled back from that approach due to the very rapid spread of the Omicron variant. But I think just to pick up on that point you mentioned before about ministers versus scientific advice, that we know from those leaked minutes from SAGE, which is the committee of the government's scientific advisors, that they had a broad consensus around around more measures. But you've got to remember, ministers have to take into account many other factors. There's the health of the economy, there's the mental health of the country, there's also the fact that, are these going to be effective and are they going to be listened to? Will people just break them anyway? And I think Professor Chris Whitty spoke at a select committee last week, and he said, look, ultimately, these are very difficult decisions to make, and it's up to politicians to make them. It's not scientific advice to say what should or shouldn't be done here. And, you had that meeting today with the Prime Minister, with Professor Whitty and Sir Patrick Vallance, the Chief Scientific Officer. And I'm sure if they felt restrictions had to come in, then they would have done so. But I think Lucy did touch on a very interesting point here, which is that in the past, the government has gone for quite heavy-handed measures on this stuff. We've had 3 lockdowns. We've had tiering systems, regional restrictions, you name it. We've tried them all in this country. This time, they are very much shifted it. And in terms of potentially overreacting, they are very much underreacting. And the bet is that the modelling is off. And so far, some of the modelling does seem to have been a bit amiss in terms of the severity of Omicron and how it's leading to hospitalizations. But it is such a big gamble at the moment. And I think really in a month's time, we could look back and say, Boris Johnson, hasn't he been lucky? Hasn't this paid off well for him? Or we could look back and say, OK, he's really blown it. And that will then go on top of all his other political troubles.
Yes, and Lucy, to the Mail, which is very much of the school of thought, parties get the go-ahead. But will it be party now and pay for it later?
Well, possibly. It's in a buoyant, upbeat tone the Mail has taken, as you say. But I do think we have to remember what Sajid Javid has warned today is for people to continue to wear masks, to celebrate with the windows open where possible, to take a test before going out, and with this sort of general message of caution. It's not a free-for-all for everyone to go wild and forget that we are still in the midst of the pandemic. So I think the messaging that the government is trying to put out is still very much one of wariness. But clearly people are happy. Sebastian pointed out, the economy is a major factor in all this. Already people have been self-locking down for much of December. I know I wanted to be with my family and so didn't want to risk catching COVID by going out to other social events. Many other people felt the same and so weren't frequenting bars, restaurants, other venues, which they ordinarily would be in December. So I think it's really good news for all those venues that will be able to bring in punters on New Year's Eve and try and claw back some revenue.
Yes, let's hope so. Sebastian and Lucy, for the moment, thank you.